Who was the first lady, you ask? Well, this might sound like an obvious one. George Washington's wife, Martha, right? Well, no, not right. And some of this has to do with what we mean by first lady. If all we mean is the spouse of the president, then I guess Martha Washington would be the first lady. And here I guess I should say that at the time I speak, in the summer of 2020, there have been no women presidents, so there haven't been any first husbands or first guys or first men. So until now, it's first lady. We're speaking historically. Anyway, so in our time, first lady is the honorific for the president's wife. But first lady actually has come to mean more than that, because it means the woman who is the hostess at the White House, the one who in some cases, in some administrations, in many cases, is a stand-in for the president. The president can't be everywhere, but nonetheless the administration wants to be represented in certain places, and so the first lady goes in the place of the president. Well, this was by no means something that everybody expected when the presidency was created. As I've discussed in earlier talks, nobody exactly knew what the presidency was going to be until George Washington occupied it. And as much confidence as they had, as the framers of the Constitution had, that George Washington would be the first president, nobody consulted Martha Washington about being the first spouse, being this person who is going to play a political role. And she had no desire to do so, and she did not. Now, some of this was a consequence as well of the fact that during the first decade of the government under the Constitution, during the first decade of the presidency, the president didn't have an official home. The White House had not yet been built, and the government was moving around. It started out in New York, it went to Philadelphia. And so it was not common, and it certainly wasn't common, for Martha Washington to live with her husband in the capital, because, well, she didn't go to New York, and she typically didn't go to Philadelphia. She stayed home at Mount Vernon. She was used to being apart from her husband, who spent many months at a time apart from Martha, amounting to years apart from Martha during the Revolutionary War. And so she was pretty well settled into Mount Vernon. And so there was no first lady, really, in the first administration, the administration of George Washington. When John Adams became president, again, the president didn't have an official home. The White House was under construction by the end of his presidency. In fact, he finally moved in at the end of his presidency. But Abigail Adams, again, she had no desire to get into the thick of politics in the national capital. And when the White House opened for residents, when the government moved to Washington in 1800, Washington was a village out in the wilderness. It was this city that was created from a forest, and the forest was still largely untamed when John Adams finished his presidency. So the first person who could have been called a first lady in the usual sense, well, would have been the wife of Thomas Jefferson. But Thomas Jefferson was a widower. His wife had died years before he became president, and so he did not have a spouse. One of his daughters did serve as sort of a hostess in the White House. Now that the president had a home, the White House, usually called the Executive Mansion, officially called the Executive Mansion, informally called the White House because it was painted white. And so his daughter served as hostess for receptions and the like, but it's still not the same thing. So the first lady, the first person who is commonly considered first lady in anything like the recognizably modern sense was the wife of Jefferson's successor, James Madison. His wife was Dolly Madison. Dolly Madison, in fact, almost created the role of first lady because she was exactly what people wanted from a first lady. She was very good looking, she was vivacious, she was smart, she was energetic. When James Madison hosted receptions or dinners, she was the life of the party. And she was glamorous, and she was sort of all the stuff that in many ways her husband was not. James Madison was, well, he was smart, yes, that's true. But he was a retiring type. He wasn't somebody who could command a dinner table. Dolly Madison did. And so Dolly Madison demonstrated that if a president has a spouse, this live-in partner, who can project good things about the administration, it is a huge advantage to a president. And Dolly Madison really sort of won her place in American history in the immediate period preceding the British invasion of Washington, D.C. amid the War of 1812. The British were coming. The British were coming. And troops were moving into the outskirts of Washington when Dolly Madison ran around the White House grabbing the irreplaceable stuff, including the signature portrait of George Washington, and scooted out the side door just ahead of the British. And so for her spunk in doing this and saving these irreplaceable objects of art, and in her own way sort of standing up to the British, Dolly Madison won the reputation of being the First Lady. And she set a high bar. During the 19th century, most presidential spouses really didn't want to have a whole lot to do with politics. Sometimes they stayed mostly back home, wherever home was. Travel was difficult in the 19th century before railroads become common. And even after railroads, it could take days getting from where you lived to where you were going. In those days, the presidency wasn't anywhere near the full-time job it would become in the 20th century. And so presidents might very well kiss their wives goodbye and say, honey, I'll be home in 3 months. And then they'd come home. Andrew Jackson would come home when Congress wasn't in session. He'd be gone from Washington for 4 months at a time. Now, in his case, his wife had died before he became president. And this was the sort of thing that happened to presidents sort of more in that period of history than later. So Dolly Madison established the idea of being First Lady, but it would really only be in the 20th century that First Lady, as this sort of semi-official office, would take form that looks, well, very much the way it looks today.